Right, good evening, or good morning if you're watching this in the morning. Good afternoon if you're watching this in the afternoon. Thank you for tuning in to the lecture on Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams. And thank you also for forgiving the HD view of my face for the next 30 to 40 minutes. I'm going to try and make this lecture fairly brief because it's been a long day for me. I just had a long faculty meeting, but also, again, I'm sure you don't really want to just stare at me on your screen for too long. I want to start, though, before I get to Freud, just recapping a few things from the Wimsatt and Beardsley class we had this afternoon. First, I just want to say that, I think the important thing from Wimsatt and Beardsley to remember is their account of the fact that the poem itself shows what the poet is trying to do. That is on page 1233. They also say on page 1235 that they don't wish to make the poet outside the poem an authority. What does that mean, the poet outside of the poem? That seems to actually imply that there's a poet inside the poem, which is kind of a weird idea. But I think if we think about it, how we often refer to literary texts, we might be able to see that. We might think, for example, and talk about Tolstoy's expansive moral vision in a work like War and Peace. When we refer to Tolstoy's expansive moral vision, we don't exactly mean what kind of a guy Tolstoy was to his wife or family or to his serfs. In fact, he might have been a quite nasty guy to those people. What we mean by Tolstoy is the Tolstoy we infer from the works he's written, the Tolstoy of War and Peace, we might even say. And later works of literary criticism and theory in trying to deal with this concept of intentionality versus meaning in the text have come up with the term the implied author. The implied author is just what it means. It means the author that is implied by the text itself. It has no necessary connection with the biographical author. So I think that's what Wimsatt and Beardsley are actually getting at when they talk about the poet inside the poem, as opposed to the poet outside of the poem. I think it's also important that we can sort of see that the poet outside of the poem, or the author, Tolstoy, might be completely interesting. Biographically, we might be fascinated by his biography. We might be fascinated by what we see as a distance or difference between what he was supposedly like in his life and what the kind of ideas the works impress, what kind of impression the works give us. Or we might see those things as corresponding, and that might help us be, the biographical information there might help us reinforce insights we get from the text itself. So I think in practice we are often quite concerned with biographical details, but it's just that, and especially for Wimsatt and Beardsley, these are not part of the meaning of the novel. They may help, again, they may help us reinforce what we see in the novel by saying we see this elsewhere in the poet's life, or it may provide a stark contrast, a surprising contrast, if we see that the poet was very different than she is on the page. One final thing I think to remember about Wimsatt and Beardsley is probably their famous line with which they conclude the essay, that such debates about literary meaning are not answered by consulting the oracle. That's a very famous phrase of theirs. Move on to the affective fallacy, which we didn't talk too much about in class today. The affective fallacy, they say on page 1246, often comes from a confusion of the poem with its results. They also talk a lot about the emotional effect of poems and what they refer to as emotional relativism. I'll come back to this last term of relativism in a moment. They say on page 1249, a little bit later, right at the bottom of that long middle paragraph on 1249, that none of these examples, and here there are several examples of misuses of words, none of these examples offers any evidence, in short, that what a word does to a person is to be ascribed to anything except what it means, or if this connection is not apparent at the most, and with a little reflection by what it suggests. Again, they say what a word does shouldn't be ascribed to anything except what it means. And again, I think we can think about this with some examples from common sense. If the word cat always makes you feel sad because it reminds you of your dead cat, or if you have synesthesia, which is the experience some people reportedly have of seeing certain words as having colors or smells, if the word sunshine always makes you taste blueberries, these don't have to do with the meanings of the word cat and the word sunshine. They may be what they do to you, but it's not what the meanings of the words do to you. And so these may be part of your experience of a poem, and so they may again be intensely important to you, but they're not part of the poem's meaning, and they're not part of especially what these theorists are looking at as the objective meaning or experience of a work of literature, which is determined by the words on the page. In general, I think we can see a lot of their argument in terms of an effort to see literature as objective rather than subjective, and that they're searching for an objective or even scientific mode of criticism. This also explains their attack on relativism. Relativism might mean that the poem can mean anything to anyone. Now, there are a number of other interesting things they go to with regard to why we shouldn't just trust people's emotions as somehow referring to the poem. They say that emotions are notably unreliable. They refer on 1250 to mob mentality, mob psychology, psychosis and neurosis, free-floating anxiety. They talk about how emotions are notably unreliable. They even say that hallucination is another way of putting affective theory. On the top of 1253, by contrast, they say, I think what they're seeking to do, they say right at the top of 1253, an important distinction can be made between those who have coolly investigated what poetry does to others and those who have testified to what it does to themselves. And again, I think Wimsatt and Beardsley want to portray themselves as cool investigators who are talking objectively, not testifying about what poetry has done to themselves. They also explain what the problem is with subjective emotional reactions. They're notoriously unreliable and cannot be refuted. And they say this at the top of 1256. The report of some readers, on the other hand, that a poem or story induces in them vivid images, intense feelings, or heightened consciousness is neither anything which can be refuted, nor anything which it is possible for the objective critic to take into account. And so this is basically to say, if you say this poem makes me feel sad, and I say this poem makes me feel happy, nobody can just refute these things unless we're talking about what in the poem produces those feelings. And I think that's the key for them, which is that the emotional reactions that can be traced to what they call an object, a precise object on 1257 within the poem, and by that they mean language that suggests those emotions, those kind of emotional reactions are completely legitimate because, again, they can be traced to some objective source or some stable source, which is the meaning of the words that are in the text themselves. Okay, I think the final important thing to note about Wimsatt and Beardsley's points about intentionality and about, or anti-intentionality, and about the lack of validity of readers' subjective responses is that these debates are far from settled. We're going to see some other critics take much different attacks on these questions, and even in popular culture, these debates continue to surface. I found a March 2015 article in the New York Times Sunday Book Review called "Should an Author's Intention Matter?" and it was a debate between two different writers about this question. So these debates are still alive and quite vibrant. Okay. Let's move on to Freud. I want to just introduce Freud by saying, with the possible exception of Karl Marx, it's probably hard to think of a more influential thinker of the last 2 centuries. And Freud may just be the most influential thinker of the last century. It's not just that he's the father of modern psychoanalysis, although he is that, and we owe to Freud most modern practices of therapy. The whole idea of the talking cure, of lying on the couch to tell a therapist your problems, has become so much a part of our culture that you might think of, The Sopranos, one of our most acclaimed television shows, starts with the premise that, what if a mafia boss also has problems with his mother that he needs to work through with a therapist? The fact that a show might take that, such a successful and popular show as The Sopranos, might take that as its premise, I think shows just how far Freud's methods of psychoanalysis have penetrated into our culture. That we almost take these things for granted, that therapy and issues with one's parents are something that people need to work through in later life. We get lots of other things from Freud, of course, the notion of the Oedipal complex, but also terms like the Freudian slip. I very well remember a girl in my high school AP biology class who she was talking in class and referred to an amoeba as a single-celled organism, and she was mortified. I think the funny thing and the point of this story is that I already at that point knew that what she had made was a Freudian slip. She's since recovered, I'm glad to report. Moreover, from Freud, we get a whole notion of how the mind and consciousness work that has really revolutionized our thinking by suggesting that much of the brain operates deeply beneath the surface of conscious thought, in a place that Freud calls the unconscious. And popularly, people often make a mistake and call this the subconscious. And maybe they're referring to something different, but I think sometimes they confuse subconscious and unconscious. People might say, oh, I think I got lost because subconsciously I didn't really want to go to dinner with my in-laws. And, maybe the wish to avoid your mother-in-law is subconscious, it's just maybe slightly below the surface. The unconscious for Freud is not slightly below the surface. It is deeply, deeply below consciousness and not really recoverable by the conscious mind except through extensive therapy and what he calls the talking cure. So the unconscious is much deeper, and it's in fact defined by that which consciousness can't really access. Well, okay, so this is Freud's influence, but what might he have to do with literature or theory? Several things, I think. First, to get at the unconscious, Freud engages in interpretation. Literary critics analyze the language of texts in order to interpret the meanings of texts. Freud argues that we could interpret people's dreams, memories, certain jokes, slips of the tongue, and works of literature to reveal underlying desires or anxieties of the unconscious. So Freud is also a crucial figure in just the history of interpretation or hermeneutics. I wish I had a whiteboard here, but you can see my office doesn't have one. And I was embarrassed to do this in a room by myself. Hermeneutics, Hermeneutic, hermeneutics is the study of interpretation or interpretive practice. And Freud has been a crucial figure in the history of interpretation or hermeneutics, particularly in what has been called the hermeneutics of suspicion. Accounts of hermeneutics, and Culler talks about this in later chapters of the Introduction to Theory that I gave you, distinguishes between a hermeneutics of recovery, which usually seeks to reconstruct the original context of a literary text and figure out how it was produced, the circumstances and maybe even intentions of the author, the meanings that text might have had for original readers, and that's a kind of hermeneutics of recovery. From a hermeneutics of suspicion, which might read against the grain of a text and try to reveal the unexamined assumptions, political, ideological, sexual, or linguistic on which a text might rely. So hermeneutics of suspicion looks to sort of read a text and see sort of what lurks below the surface of the text that maybe the author didn't even consciously know about or takes for granted as given. Freud has been crucial to this mode of hermeneutics of suspicion. In seeing dreams and jokes as texts that reveal hidden desires or traumas, Freud founded a kind of interpretive practice that could also be applied to literary texts to see what kinds of latent meanings were hidden under their surfaces. These could reveal the hidden desires of the author or secondary meanings hidden underneath the conscious or primary meanings of words. Or we might see in characters' actions or in characters' dreams certain desires that they have beneath the surface or certain other motives. So Freud has given scholars in literary criticism and other fields methods of reading and interpreting meanings and assumptions that lie beneath the surface. I often think literature is not really a secret code, and what we really want to do when we study literature is explain just how it works, just how it says what it says. But there's certainly another strand of literary interpretation, and even one that's often mocked in popular culture, that's about decoding the symbols and figuring out what literature really says beneath what it seems to say. Secondly, Freud used literary text as his examples, as we see in this selection from the interpretation of dreams. In particular, he used fairy tales and certain very classic and central stories like Oedipus and Hamlet. He used these literary texts as examples to demonstrate his theories, really as evidence for them, because he often that they reveal deep structures of psychology and behavior, though again, often these were encoded and need interpreting. The stories need interpreting in order to reveal these deep structures of behavior of psychology. And for Freud also, these texts gain their lasting power, they gain their classic status because they in some ways capture some deeply rooted drive or behavior in humans. So, for example, Oedipus has no idea that he's killing his father or marrying his mother, but for Freud, the fact that these actions were his fate as decreed by the oracle registers a deep unconscious wish. In a way, his destiny, what the play calls his fate that he can't escape, dramatizes a unconscious motive for Freud. We'll come back to the example of Oedipus in a bit. So Freud therefore offers literary critics a way of reading texts to show how they might reveal deep structures of human desire, thought, or behavior, and repression of taboo actions, again, that are kind of encoded deeply within those classic stories. Third, since literature often depicts people's consciousnesses and states of feeling, and it can even do some things that are impossible in real life, like tell us exactly what somebody is thinking and give a window into their mind, literary writers have been greatly influenced by Freudian psychology, and they often seek to represent characters who experience conflicts between levels of their conscious and unconscious thought or repressed desires based on childhood traumas. And so Freud has had an incredible influence on writers of literary texts who seek to dramatize or depict the states of mind of their characters. Freud has had a great influence on these writers. Fourth, Freudian psychology gives us an avenue for interpreting texts that are about characters' mental lives, even if the author was not consciously influenced by Freud, or even if the writer wrote before Freud did. So, for example, in many works of Edgar Allan Poe, there are terrifying scenes of being buried alive. And for Freud, this represented being buried alive represented a repressed desire to return to one's mother's womb. Poe was writing a good 50 years or so before the dissemination of Freud's theories, and decades before Freud was even born. Freud gives us a way of understanding the presence of such terrifying themes and symbols as being buried alive in Poe. But certainly we can do this with later texts as well, and we can take a psychoanalytic approach to ask how texts represent consciousness of their characters. And finally, Freud has really revolutionized the way we think about the mind and consciousness and rational thought. Even if you don't buy all of Freud's theories, or even if he's not right about the specifics of how consciousness works, I think his contention that people often do things and don't always know just why they do them is extremely influential and powerful as a theory. The notion of a mind that is divided or that doesn't entirely know itself may help explain why people don't always behave in their best interests or why they do things that they know they shouldn't do, and how we might not always be in control of our own minds. All right, so this has been incredibly powerful in a variety of ways, Freud's theory. I'm now going to move over to the selection we read from the Interpretation of Dreams, which begins on page 814, and like in class, you should follow along in your book. Freud begins by talking about the Oedipus complex. Now, I think one of the very controversial and kind of icky and just ideas that we are very resistant to comes right off the bat in this section from the Interpretation of Dreams, where Freud says that, and this is on 814, being in love with the one parent and hating the other are among the essential constituents of the stock psychical impulses, which is formed at that time and which is of such importance in determining the symptoms of the later neuroses. But this is here's the real kicker, and the part that I think just gets people so, they just are so resistant to this. But Freud then goes on to say, it's not my belief, however, that psychoneurotics differ sharply in this respect from other human beings who remain normal. He says that they psychoneurotics just exhibit on a magnified scale feelings of love and hatred to their parents, which occur less obviously and less intensely in the minds of most children. So again, this is, I think, what people are really resistant to, but I think this is part of Freud's really provocative claim here, which is that this is part of the deep structure of minds of all children, is this wish to kill one's father and to make love to one's mother. Okay, now I think it's also important to note that Freud here says feelings of love and hatred. So what he calls psychosexual impulses are not exactly sexual in a literal sense. Okay, I think Freud thinks that the Oedipal complex registers this as the desire to have sex with one's mother, but I think it's also can be extended to just love and hatred more generally. We feel extreme affection for one parent and jealousy or competition with another parent. But also, once again, I think I should make clear that I'm not necessarily endorsing wholesale Freud's theories, but first just trying to understand exactly what he's claiming. Okay, well, Freud says at the top of page 815, he says this discovery, the discovery he's made about all children's impulses of love and hatred towards their parents, this discovery at the top of 815 is confirmed by a legend that has come down to us from classical antiquity, a legend whose profound and universal power to move can only be understood if the hypothesis I've put forward in regard to the psychology of children has equally universal validity. Now you can see the modesty of Freud's claims here. Its profound and universal power can only be understood if his hypothesis is correct. Freud is not exactly timid or bashful in the strength of his contentions. I think it's also interesting to note that for Freud, literature confirms his observation. It is backup. It serves as a form of evidence on top of his clinical observations. This is not necessarily the only way to use literature, although I think it's certainly the case that many people use literature as evidence. For example, of history, we might think that in works of literature from periods that are long, long ago, we actually have a form of historical documentation. For Freud, literature serves as a form of psychological documentation. He then says in the middle of page 815, right after the quotation, that the action of the play, Oedipus Rex, Sophocles' play, consists in nothing other than the process of revealing, with cunning delays and ever-mounting excitement, a process that can be likened to the work of a psychoanalysis. So in the play Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, we get a progressive revelation of what Oedipus has done. Of course, we, the audience, usually know beforehand, and the Greek audience, it appears, was really familiar with the Oedipus myth long before they saw this play. It was a household, he was a household name, if you will. But in the play, there's a process of progressively revealing what Oedipus has done. I don't think it's coincidental that Freud picks a play that reveals the Oedipal desire that he talks about, but also one that is about revelation. It mimics or imitates the process of the talking cure, of the patient who progressively comes to discover some repressed incident or desire through talking, through progressive analysis with the therapist. I don't think it's a coincidence that he picks a play that has a similar structure of progressive revelation. Freud, interestingly, does a kind of literary interpretation of Oedipus. He says in the next paragraph, the last full paragraph in 815, that Oedipus Rex is commonly known as a tragedy of destiny. Its tragic effect is said to lie in the contrast between the supreme will of the gods and the vain attempts of mankind to escape the evil that threatens them. So here Freud takes a kind of conventional reading of Oedipus and critiques it. He says, most people think Oedipus is about a conflict between the will of the gods and man's free will, and that we see in the unfolding of the play just how little free will men have. We can't really escape our destiny or the will of the gods. He disputes that common sense at the bottom of 815, and he says that there are lots of tragedies of destiny, but they have failed in their effect. He goes on to say, if Oedipus moves a modern audience no less than it did a contemporary Greek one, the explanation can only be, again not very modest, can only be that its effect does not lie in the contrast between destiny and human will, but it is to be looked for in the particular nature of the material on which that contrast is exemplified. There must be something which makes a voice within us ready to recognize the compelling force of destiny in the Oedipus, while we can dismiss as merely arbitrary such dispositions that are laid down as in the work of Grillparzer or other modern tragedies of destiny. So here Freud has a kind of interesting explanation for the canonical or classic status of Oedipus Rex. It continues to move us because it's not just about destiny. Destiny is not something that typically moves us still, or doesn't necessarily, but it's something about the nature of what the material of that destiny is that continues to affect us. Well, he gets even more specific at the top of 816 and says, his destiny moves us because it might have been ours, because the oracle laid the same curse upon us before our birth as upon him. It is the fate of all of us, perhaps, here's a little bit of a hedge and some modesty, because it might have been ours, because perhaps to direct our first sexual impulse toward our mother and our first hatred and first murderous wish against our father. Oedipus, who slew his father Laius and married his mother Jocasta, merely shows us the fulfillment of our own childhood wishes. And he goes on to say, we shrink from Oedipus. This tragedy moves us with pity and fear, in Aristotle's words, because we repress this desire. We recognize it, but we repress it, and this is what causes the kind of intense and visceral reaction to the play. He also says that Sophocles is, quote, compelling us, this is still on 816, to recognize our own inner minds. There's some more evidence that Freud brings to make his case. He talks about right at the top of 817 that there's a reference in Oedipus Rex to a dream within the play. One of the characters says, many men ere now in dreams hath lain with her who bare him. So Oedipus actually addresses the fact that many men have had this dream of sleeping with their mothers. The play is both in a kind of deep structure, the plot of the play about this, but it also explicitly references the fact that many people have this impulse. And then the outcome of the play, importantly, at the middle of that first paragraph in 817, Freud writes, just as these dreams, when dreamt by adults, are accompanied by feelings of repulsion, nobody wants to really admit to having these dreams. They're repelled and even disgusted with themselves when they have these dreams. So too the legend must include horror and self-punishment, and this is why Freud is arguing at the end of Oedipus Rex, Oedipus blinds himself. That registers our own feelings of repulsion towards these childhood, infantile wishes. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and bet, and be willing to bet that most of you are thinking BS. You probably don't buy this. You don't think that you have any wish or ever have had any wish to sleep with your mother or kill your father. And that's fair. You may not. But I want to also say that Freud's argument makes it somewhat impossible to argue against. Because if we had these feelings, we would repress them and push them down so deeply we wouldn't know we had them. Or if we began to think, hey, maybe there's an inkling of truth to what Freud is saying, we would immediately repress that. We would say, no, it's not true. So, we probably resist this argument, but that would be completely consistent with what Freud would think we would do. We would not want to admit this because it is such a taboo subject that the conscious mind has to repress it. Okay, Freud goes on to talk about Hamlet. There's an interesting little segue at the beginning of that first full paragraph in 817. Another of the great creations of tragic poetry, Shakespeare's Hamlet, has its roots in the same soil as Oedipus. Here we see that Freud is using metaphors, roots in the same soil. But he says there's a significant difference in Hamlet. Freud argues that in the centuries, it would be about 2,000 years. Again, math, never my strong suit. In about 2,000 years between Oedipus, which was written in about the 5th century BC in Athens, and Hamlet, written in 1600 in England, there has been a secular advance of repression, where there's a wishful fantasy that is taboo but gets depicted and enacted in Oedipus. It remains repressed within Hamlet. We don't ever see Hamlet. He doesn't kill his father. He doesn't sleep with his mother. We only know about his wishful fantasy through how it inhibits the character. In Freud's reading, Hamlet is a kind of neurotic. He has a bunch of inhibitions in his actions, and these are due to his unconscious wishes, to his neuroses, due to being unable to satisfy his desire to sleep with his mother and kill his father, and also his kind of guilt about his desires to do so. Well, again, Freud takes issue with what is a conventional or typical or canonical reading of Hamlet. He says, you probably think, and this is at the bottom of 817, that Hamlet is about a person who is pathologically irresolute. He cannot make up his mind. You've probably heard this. Maybe the one thing everybody knows about Hamlet, he's too indecisive. He's incapable of acting. But, Freud says, and he uses examples from the text, there are moments when Hamlet is actually quite resolute in his action, even a bit rash in his action. He kills Polonius quite abruptly, stabbing him through the arras, and then he sends his two friends, the bumbling Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to their death in England. Well, this for Freud is evidence that it's actually not action as such that Hamlet has a problem with, but a particular kind of action. At the bottom of page 817, he writes, Hamlet is able to do anything except take vengeance on the man who did away with his father and took that father's place with his mother, the man who shows him the repressed wishes of his own childhood realized. Okay, thus, because Polonius does what because Claudius, Hamlet's stepfather, does what he wants to do, kill his father and take his mother, Hamlet recognizes his own desires in Claudius and therefore can't kill him. This is the only action, according to Freud, that Hamlet has trouble committing. He goes on to say that Hamlet's distaste for sexuality, he makes a bunch of terms about how sort of gross he thinks the reproductive parts and processes are in the play. He says this also fits in very well with what he's seen in hysterical patients. And Freud also sees this distaste for sexuality in Shakespeare's play Timon of Athens, and he also says fathers and sons are big issues in a number of Shakespeare plays, and he actually says that it is the poet's own mind which confronts us in Hamlet. So there's another level here at which Freud reads works of literature. He actually reads them not only as registering characters who have unconscious wishes and anxieties, but he actually says it's the author's acting out of his neurotic symptoms. Excuse me, not the actor, but the author. It's not a bad mistake. So many of you may know that Shakespeare was an actor as well as a writer in his own plays. Anyway, though, Freud reads Shakespeare's preoccupation with the kind of more distasteful aspects of sexuality and his preoccupation with fathers and sons as an enactment of his own anxieties or neurotic symptoms about his relation to his father. Okay. In the next section of the selection here, we get Freud's introduction of the concept of the dream work. Now here he introduces two very important concepts: the manifest dream content and the latent dream thoughts. So manifest is what's apparent. This is the dream content, what happens in the dream, that's what's manifest. And the latent, which means existing but hidden, dream thoughts, which are the thoughts that give rise to the dream content. He says from the dream thoughts if we can disentangle the meaning of the dream content, we can get to the dream thoughts. We can get the meaning of this content. He gives a couple analogies on the top of 819. He says that the dream thoughts and dream content are presented to us like two versions of the same subject matter in two different languages, or the dream content seems like a transcript of the dream thoughts in another mode of expression, whose characters and syntactic laws it is our business to discover. And then he kind of gives this elaborate, extended analogy that the dream content, what we see in the dream, is similar to, analogous to, he doesn't think it literally is, like a rebus, those little cartoons we get with several pictures, and if we sound out those pictures, we get a series of words or a common phrase. He says that dreams work like that. If we can sort of figure out the language, the pictures, and visual aspects of the dream represents the dream content represents some latent dream thoughts. Freud then goes on to explain the two major aspects of dream work. The first, at the bottom of 819, is the work of condensation. And he says that dreams compress a whole lot of material so that when we give an account of our dreams, it's fairly short. And what the analyst has to do is tease that out. It actually represents a much longer and more extensive story or aspect of consciousness. And also that is sort of endlessly interpretable. We can probably see here certain analogies with literary interpretation. The second part, and the more important one of the dream work, is the work of displacement. And he says that when somebody is recounting a dream, they often bring in very remote thoughts, and they're not exactly sure how they're connected to the dreams. Um, and and Freud says these actually constitute the connections between the dream content and dream thoughts. These forced or often far-fetched connections. In the middle of 820, he describes the work of displacement as such. He says, it on the one hand strips the elements which have a high psychical value of their intensity, and on the other hand, by means of overdetermination, which is having multiple factors or multiple causes, creates from elements of low psychical value new values, which afterwards find their way into the dream content. If that is so, a transference and displacement of psychical intensities occurs in the process of dream formation, and as a result of these, that the difference between the text of the dream content and of the dream thoughts comes about. Okay, so here you have some really intense psychic thoughts. It could be, the infantile desire to sleep with your mother, or it could be a really awful thing that happened in your childhood. Perhaps your mother hit you, or perhaps you were abused sexually. The work of displacement strips the elements that have this high psychical charge of their intensity and displaces them. It changes them into some other form. And Freud says that this displacement is nothing less than the essential portion of the dream work, and it deserves to be described as dream displacement. Very importantly, he says the reason for this dream displacement, or the psychical force behind it, and this is very important, you should remember this, I might ask you about it on Tuesday. The psychical force that is responsible for displacement is what he calls censorship. He calls it, at the bottom of 820, the censorship of endopsychic defense. So just as we repress and bury in the unconscious certain desires or certain childhood traumas that might be too taboo or too hurtful, too distressing to think about in our conscious mind, so the dream displacement does some work on those same unconscious subjects. It censors them. If it represented them if it represented them literally, as it were, they would be extremely troubling to us. We would wake up and be exceedingly distressed. As a form of endopsychic defense, according to Freud, the dream work does this work of displacement. Okay. Freud finally, in this selection, talks about certain means of interpreting dreams. He talks about how dreams don't like language, have logical connectors, and he talks about how dreams may represent ideas that are close together or which have priority. I'm less concerned with the particulars here than the fact that dreams have a language or work as a language, according to Freud. They are a way of representing meanings that is quite akin to the work of representation. There is a signifier, the dream content, and the signified, which is below the surface, a dream thought. But we also might note that this relationship between a signifier and a signified works differently than Saussure's account of language. It is not one. It is not conscious, of course, and where the same sign represents both the signifier and the signified, one sign, I don't know, an umbrella represents some other signified, not an umbrella. So where Saussure, the sign, like two sides of a paper, represents both a signifier and signified, we have one signifier that represents some other signified for Freud and in the work of dreams. And also, Brooks's account of how meaning works is very different. The meaning of a poem for Cleanth Brooks is both its form and content. Here in Freud, there is the manifest form, what we see in the dream content, and the dream thoughts, which are the latent meaning. And there's a big separation between the form and content. Right. There's a big, vast overview of Freud, but also I think some of the ways in which Freud is very relevant to literary study, interpretation, meaning, and our accounts of how consciousness works. And I look forward to meeting a week from Tuesday, February 9th, and I'll happily take any questions from you at that time. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy your week with no class, and I will see you soon.